23 seconds. That's the time I spent when I was actually alive with 3 people on an elevator. And it's led to all this. Just 23 seconds. My name is Tim Kono. I lived in apartment 9A here at the Arconia. Approximately 12 minutes from now, I will be murdered.
Hey everybody, Victor here again with Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, we will briefly be covering the season finale of Only Murders in the Building. Pretty straightforward, so that should be a minority of the episode here. But the rest of the episode will be going into Succession, which premiered with its season 3 premiere just this week, just this past Sunday. So I'll be giving you the background on the show, some of the inspirations for it, kind of my history with the show as well, and then where we left things off with season 2, and of course, a recap of this current episode. I'll be adding some additional detail here, or maybe even have a separate mini episode with my wife and Sona when she's available to record to talk about both of these topics. But for now, it's just me. I'm going to skip recommendations right now and get right into Only Murders in the Building. I'll be giving you additional recommendations this weekend in the Horror Corner episodes, which should drop probably Friday. I hope I can make my deadline this time. I'll actually have a whole bunch of horror recommendations because so much horror stuff has come out. Probably be reviewing a couple of those movies, plus giving you recommendations of maybe better movies in line with some of these things that have become recently available. But the rest of that episode actually won't be another horror discussion. It'll actually be a review of Dune, which is coming out this weekend. The new mega budgeted Dune, which has already opened overseas and is making a lot of money overseas, by the way, and has gotten pretty rapturous reviews since it premiered at the film festivals. But I'm still a little skeptical about it, and maybe it's just bad advertising, but I'm definitely curious to see it, and I'm sure it will look incredible, which I can already tell from the previews, but I'll see how it works as a film in general. So keep your eyes open for that. It'll be dropping later in the week, over the weekend potentially. And the usual, make sure you review us, rate us, subscribe to us so that we can find new listeners. Recommend me to somebody else. Recommend our podcast to somebody else if you think they might be interested or you want to just have a conversation about us with somebody else. That always helps grow our audience, of course. And you can always reach out to me at needsomeintroduction@gmail.com. But to get things going, finally, Only Murders in the Building, Episode 10, Open and Shut. All right, so let's cut straight to it. Jan is the killer. Definitely something that would make sense given the evidence that we saw last week. And as a matter of fact, I will pat myself on the back, even though I don't deserve credit for any of this, for having called her out. Literally the first time she showed up in the show, and I think it was in the very first episode or second episode, and I said to Sona right away, if I had to lay money today, at this moment, as to who the killer is, it's going to be Jan. Just because Amy Ryan's too big a star to bring onto the show for such a small thing.
You're not drinking much.
Oh, I'm not drinking at all. I'm taking stage sips. Because there's poison in it. It's what you did with Tim Kono, right? A breakup drink before you shot him with his own gun? I'm still not sure why you poisoned the cat, though.
I didn't do that. All I can think is she came in the window afterwards, and maybe. I know, right?
I did the same thing, by the way, when we recapped Mayor of Easttown. As soon as Guy Pearce showed up, I'm like, Guy Pearce is the killer. Guy Pearce is too big to be in the show. He's the killer. And minor spoilers, if you haven't watched that show, he was not. I won't tell you who it was, though. You should definitely watch that one to find out. But yeah, I'll pat myself on the back because I used the whole generic Murder, She Wrote way of solving a crime of just basically looking at who's the biggest name in the not main cast, and that's going to be your killer. So not using any of my knowledge other than like cliches to solve this. And how happy am I about this? I have to say that as much as I have enjoyed the show, I really was hoping for something a little bit better here at the end. I still would definitely recommend the show, and I definitely will watch the second season simply because I think the writing is so sharp and so funny. The show was kind of punching above its weight in a way where I thought it was actually bringing to light some interesting real themes. These ideas of people in a city, even people who theoretically would be considered quote unquote successful, who are dealing with this crushing anonymity and loneliness that living in the city can provide. And Sona lives in New York City, and I've spent a lot of time in New York City. And I think it's a legitimate thing. Like sometimes you feel like you're surrounded by people and you're alienated at the same time. And these are older people who have kind of moved past the peaks of their careers. And I think these are all interesting topics, and I think they're legitimate topics. So this was a very funny, gag-filled, like sometimes 30, 40, 50 great lines per episode in like a 28-minute episode. So very funny, really in a way on its surface as deep as an episode of 30 Rock, for example. But I thought there was a sense of this real sadness and longing under the show that I thought was a value add. It really kind of elevated the show. And I think maybe my expectations were that high, that I thought that in the end, somehow they would tie all this together, they would tie those themes in, and it would be really satisfying in that way. As it was, what we mostly got was a kind of classic Steve Martin slapstick episode. For example, even Jan being the killer, she's not just the killer whose heart was broken. She's a serial killer, and then her escape plan is to kill everyone in the building. So she is straight up sociopath. And I have to say that I was a little disappointed with that because it seems out of character for her, from what we know of her, to be that cold-blooded, I should say. And simultaneously, that I kind of was vested in this relationship. These older couple, she's not that old, by the way, nowhere near as old as Steve Martin, for example, who's pushing 80, I think, at this point. But this kind of late in life romance between the two of them, I kind of like that. I kind of like that relationship. So it's a little disappointing that this is where we ended up. But as far as the episode itself, it's definitely entertaining. I mean, Steve Martin gets to do his All of Me thing. And there's my recommendation for the week, I guess I would say. Check out All of Me. I think it's available on Hulu, definitely available on Canopy. It's available in a bunch of places. But if you've never seen that, he won Best Actor, a bunch of Best Actor awards, although did not get an Academy Award nomination that year. In 1983, maybe, around there. And it was a movie called All of Me, where he is possessed, has to share his body with Lily Tomlin is inside of his body with him. And a lot of physical comedy, like him basically losing control of his body. And they're obviously referencing that directly in this show where you see him been drugged, lost control of his body basically, and he is trying to escape his apartment and track down Amy Ryan in the building. And meanwhile, Oliver and Mabel are trying to find him too, so they're kind of missing each other constantly. And I'm going to be honest here, this is was a little desperate, I would say. I mean, he's still a talented physical comedian, but he is pushing 80. So to see him here versus, once again, check out All of Me, like what an incredible physical performance he gives there. So funny. You know, he's obviously 50 years older than he was in that movie, and it shows. So that was a little disappointing. One joke that I thought landed perfectly was when he is doing his whole Bravo standing up and making his proclamation in his mind. And then we cut to the reality.
No. No. This ends now, Jan. You won't shoot my friends. Shoot me if you need to, but not them. Because I don't want to live in a world without them anymore. There were parts of myself that were dead that they brought back to life. Before this, I was just a hollow shell walking around, and they made me alive.
You're helping me get over you.
Drugged and has no control over his mouth. Like that kind of juxtaposition was very well done. So that worked really well. Some of the physical comedy seemed a little bit desperate, you know, maybe a little outside his wheelhouse at this point, given his age. Not to age shame anybody. I mean, they put together a really great show. And like I said, late in his career, congratulations. It's been renewed for another season. And that's where we are. I mean, that's pretty much what we get, except for one big thing. And maybe there is more here, potentially, even in this mystery, because where they leave things is, you know, they're like the conquering heroes. Everybody's patting them on the back. The show wraps up with, you know, he's lost his love, of course, but he's reconnected with Lucy via text, reached out to her again. So it seems like everybody's relationships and everybody's lives are back on the mend. This has kind of been a good thing for them. But then, of course, we see the continuation of the teaser we saw at the very beginning of the season, where they're up on the roof, basking in their victory. They've been reinstated in the building. Even Bunny is on their side now, or at least temporarily. Bunny, the co-op board head. And as they're basking in their success, they hear police sirens coming. And they're like, wait a second, are they coming here? They immediately start to try to locate Mabel. They show up at Mabel's apartment, and it turns out that the police sirens were a SWAT team coming to arrest them, of all people. So we don't even know what they've been charged with. We just know that SWAT team was called in on them. When they walk in on Mabel, we see, once again, the similar situation that we saw in the teaser to the whole show at the very, very beginning, the first episode, where Mabel's over a body, she's covered in blood, and wearing a hoodie, maybe even Oscar's OG hoodie, or maybe not. I think there's an emblem on it, so maybe it might be part of the, it might be some of the podcast swag. And she's been stabbed in the chest with Mabel's handy knitting needle, her self-defense weapon of choice. And Mabel says this isn't what it looks like. She walked in like this. She's already been stabbed. She stumbled in, stabbed already, fell upon her. And then, of course, the SWAT team shows up, so we're not able to figure out anything else beyond that. And as they're walking out, we kind of see all the guest stars we've seen this season. We see the podcaster played by Tina Fey, Cinda Canning, and we see Detective Williams telling them not to say anything, probably for their own benefit. We see their podcast fans looking adoringly, by the way, onto them, maybe impressed that they're involved in yet another murder. And of course, we see a lot of the tenants in the building that we've seen at those co-op board meetings earlier. So 2 things for the next season. And Mabel even calls us out that she's not sure this is over because there's still too many loose ends. First of all, just to call them out, Amy Ryan, Jan, returns to her apartment 2 episodes ago before she was stabbed. Someone leaves a note on her door. I'm watching you. She's threatened, does not go back, of course, because it turns out she's the killer. She's just trying to cover up for herself. But who is threatening her? There's still something more to this story. Second of all, why, theoretically, there is another killer in the building, has now gotten away with everything. Why are they now coming to frame the podcasters for yet another crime? You're just reopening a case. And then why was Bunny wearing that hoodie? Is she a secret fan of the podcast? Is this just another way to further frame them for the murder? Who knows? And that's where we leave things. Like I mentioned, pretty entertaining. But this is, to be honest, this is the finale of the show when I read this on paper that I thought I was going to get. So in that way, total success. But not more. And like I said, the show actually at some points felt like it was going for more and didn't quite go there.
My story really ends with you. Even though I didn't get to know all that went on once I left, a connection was made among 3 strangers willing to embrace
their own messes and to recognize we are all connected. We started with the question, who is Tim Kono? The answer, as it turned out, we are all Tim Kono.
That was amazing.
I mean, that's the best performance you've ever given. I have nothing left to teach you.
What did you guys think? Let me know. Drop me a line. needsomeIntroduction@gmail.com. So for the rest of the episode, we are going to be talking Succession, and we will be primarily covering the show Succession for the rest of this season, along with the new Dexter reboot, Dexter New Blood, which is coming in about 3 weeks now. So we will be definitely spending time there. And I think also Sona has been watching You. She's a big fan of You. So she will probably be recapping You to me and to you, the audience. And she'll be spoiling it for me, but that's okay. I haven't watched it up until now. I don't think I'm going to get caught up. Maybe she can convince me to watch the show. If I really get into her recaps, maybe I will watch the show and get caught up. But we will probably be talking about You here and there as well, depending on her feelings on how the show went this season. So a couple things about Succession. Created by Jesse Armstrong, who's British, by the way, who probably most famously created Peep Show back in England, which is one of the most popular sitcoms they've ever had. It ran for 12 years. It was very uncommon, by the way, for sitcoms to run this long in the UK. And it is interesting because it ran in tandem with Seinfeld and Friends, more or less, in parallel with those shows. And in a way, if you've never seen it, and it's available, by the way, to stream on a few different platforms here in the US, it's kind of a mix of Seinfeld and Friends. So I think that's why Seinfeld and Friends were never really that big in the UK, because they kind of had their own versions of it. And this show, by the way, very funny show. but these characters, these two best friends who live together, are kind of like Seinfeld, incredibly unlikable people, but kind of like Friends. It has a lot to do with like their dating lives, trying to make it at work, etc. So it kind of has that kind of day-to-day millennial, I guess at the time they wouldn't be millennials, or maybe they would be millennials, characters, and simultaneously the kind of cynical city life of Seinfeld, all mixed together. And then he started to veer into more political type material. He made the movie In the Loop. I mean, very good movie in general. And it's kind of how the UK almost stumbles into a war because of like one bad press conference. And it's kind of a satire on modern warfare and how it's tied into political egos, something that's a big theme in all of his more recent materials. And he followed that up with a movie called Four Lions, which is the first time I ever saw Riz Ahmed, I believe, in anything, which I recommended previously. I definitely recommend this as well. This is a very problematic film, but very interesting, very funny, believe it or not, actually a comedy. And it's about these four kind of down on their luck British characters. Some are of Pakistani descent. Some are just Scottish or, kind of disenfranchised Brits. And they basically form a terrorist cell. And this is basically shot like a found footage movie. And they're trying to pull off this terrorist attack. So it sounds like it's in bad taste, but it's actually very smart, and it's actually very funny and very disturbing by the end, as you would probably expect. So, I mean, almost everything he's done, I would really highly recommend. And then I think, and he says so many different things in interviews, so you're not sure how much of this to take legitimately or not. He supposedly was writing a script about the Murdoch family, Rupert Murdoch. You may know he started off as a Australian businessman. He started to buy newspapers in Australia, mostly conservative newspapers. Then he eventually started to buy tabloids all over the world. He owns the Daily News, I believe, or in New York, but also all the tabloids, most of the tabloids in England, in the UK, and starts to become this newspaper magnate all over the world. He even now owns the Wall Street Journal. But before buying the Wall Street Journal, somewhere in between, he also started to buy not only newspapers, but he bought the 20th Century Fox movie studio. He bought or created Fox, the channel, with The Simpsons and Married with Children at the time when it first premiered, and of course has been around for decades now, but at the time was the first new network in a very long time. And then of course Fox News, right, which of course is maybe the most important development in correlating to Succession, because the family here has a news network called ATN, I believe. And basically it's the analog of Fox News, a very conservative news channel in the US. So Armstrong had written a script about the Murdoch family, and it never got produced. But supposedly this is the starting point for the Succession show. But it's not just the Murdochs. I would say there's some literary references here. You can think of King Lear, the Shakespeare play about the father trying to split his land. He's kind of over the hill. He's trying to find one of his daughters to inherit the land. And there's this power struggle among the daughters, and they betray him. And so it's not one-to-one, but there definitely is some of that in the structure of the show. But in 2015, I believe it was, I might be getting the year wrong, but in 2015, I believe it was, Rupert Murdoch was on his son's yacht and was disoriented in the night. He's trying to find the bathroom, which is similar to the very first scene we see, not on a yacht in his apartment, but similar to the very first scene we see in episode 1 of Succession. And as he was stumbling around, was disoriented, he forgot he was on the yacht. He thought he was in his apartment. He made a wrong turn, fell down the stairs, and fell into a coma, basically. To the public, they said he was fine, but years later we found out that he was in a coma. He had broken his spine, he had broken his hip. He was very, very badly injured, basically. And there was a period of time where it was total chaos. Everyone was thinking, who is going to run this business? And he had issues with different ones of his children. The children were fighting amongst each other. They weren't children anymore. Of course, these people were in their 40s and 50s, but his offspring. And there are a lot of corollaries to those children. There's one who's kind of wants to go into politics. One of them was a would-be rapper, like a very bad rapper, by the way, still raps sometimes. So that's the Kendall corollary. One's a little hippy-dippy. Some want out of the news business. They think the news business is toxic for their brand. And of course, this has not happened in the show, by the way, Succession itself, but has happened in real life. As many of you may know, Fox's TV assets and the movies business has been sold to Disney, right? So if you're on Disney Plus now, that's why you can see Avatar on there. That's why you can see the Simpsons on there. This is all Fox properties that have now been acquired by Disney at the time for $40-something billion, which seemed like a lot of money. But in retrospect, maybe not so much when you consider that, for example, just the X-Men and Fantastic Four and these other Fox assets will be merging with Disney's already massive Marvel catalog. So maybe in retrospect, not a bad deal, although it seemed like a lot of money at the time. So now he's really focused on news, and I believe the stock company is called News Corp. They still own the Fox News. They still own all their newspapers. So they really are news focused, and they've split the company that way, which of course was contentious even at the time because there were elements of the family that were saying we're going to be an entertainment business, like we're going to hold on to the studio and television and we're going to get rid of news. And the exact opposite happened, right? So obviously internally there are these family members that have very different visions for what's going to happen to those assets, or wanted them to be a different vision for what was going to happen to those assets. With Rupert getting older and older, I think he's in his 90s now. So that's a thumbnail, catch up with what's happening with the Rupert Murdoch's family. But I do call out all that detail because it does inform the show. It was kind of the framework in which the show was originally created. It's become its own thing since then. Just hearing what I just described to you, you'll probably think like, oh yeah, if you've seen season 1, you know that there's a lot of these themes in that first season. But Armstrong himself has said many times that it's not only about the Murdoch family. Maybe that was the original inspiration, but there's been so many familial splits, ugly ruptures. You see it among the Trump family. You see it with the CEO of CBS and Paramount recently, who also had a Me Too scandal as well as a familial scandal. And you see how all these things tie in. So he's just folding in all these things that are happening every day among these corporate elites into this show. But I think that the Murdoch family framework is the foundational framework for this show. So in season 1, it really was about, it's set right in the title, Succession. It was about the dad coming up with a succession plan, but not really trusting that his kids are really ready. So it's him always being this really aggressively, almost stereotypically treacherous male CEO. The kind of there's a generation that really believes that this is the way CEOs should behave, and that he is not only, he in a way does want the family to inherit the business, but simultaneously he doesn't really think that they should inherit it. He doesn't think that they've earned it yet. He thinks they're too soft. So he has this duality, and he can't help but play out these toxic relationships between the kids, which have been ingrained in them since the very beginning, since their childhoods, basically. Oh, and before I forget, I got to call out that I never skip the credit sequence here because the music is incredible. Nicholas Britell, who's had an incredible career, by the way, tracked down in the New York Times in the daily feed. Just search for Nicholas Britell, Britell, and you'll see a profile on him. Fascinating story. Started off as a musician, as a hip hop DJ and producer, and you hear it in his scores that there is this classical, and he was a classical musician as well. Then he worked on Wall Street. Then he went back into doing movie soundtracks. He did the beautiful soundtrack to Moonlight, if you've ever heard that. Incredible. Very classical, though, in that work. He also did the Underground Railroad recently with the same director. And if Beale Street could talk. But another big partnership he's had is with Adam McKay. Adam McKay actually was one of the producers and the director of the pilot for Succession itself. Still the producer on the show. And he did the score for The Big Short, for example. Anyway, all I am to say that the score is excellent. It's really a character in and of itself in the show. And I love this dichotomy it has of the classical instruments, but a real hip-hop mentality to how the music is arranged. So it kind of speaks to the tension there. And not only that in the credits, but also this, someone's mentioned this before, not just me, the flashback sequences there of their childhood is very reminiscent of the movie The Game, their credit sequence there as well. If you watch very carefully, just like Easter eggs in that credit sequence of the tension, the relationships between the siblings, even in those, like who's holding hands, who's smiling. So it's very interesting, very good. And the combination of the visuals with the music is almost like a palate cleanser before you watch the show. It's really excellent. Really gets you in the mood for the episode. So I never skip the credits. So season 1, Logan, the patriarch, obviously has problems. He has dementia. This may have been going on for a while, and yet refuses to surrender control of the company. Meanwhile, his eldest, whether he just expects it, played by Jeremy Strong, Kendall, whether he was promised it or whether he just assumes it, he does think he's going to inherit that mantle. But he does have a vision for the company. He thinks that they should buy a BuzzFeed-like business called Volter in this show. I guess it's supposed to be like Gawker, maybe, although I don't think it's a tabloid, so I think it's more like BuzzFeed. So he has a vision for the direction the business should go in. He wants to be more contemporary in the media space. So he has a point, but he's also a screw up. We find out that, I mean, it's not just that he was an addict and that he's fallen off the wagon a couple times, and his father definitely sees that as a weakness. He also thinks could be a rapper. He kind of has this delusional vision of being this really hip guy.
Just remember, I'm not a professional.
Born on the North Bank, king of the East Side, 50 years strong, now he's rolling in a sick ride. Handmade suits, raking in loot. 5-star general, y'all best salute. Yo, bitches speak catty, but the King Kong daddy. Rock all the haters while we go roll a fatty. Squiggle on the decks, Kenny on the rhymes, and Logan big ballin' on Hampton's time. L to the OG, dude be the OG. A-N he playing like a pro. L to the OG.
And what's interesting about him as a character, and we'll circle back to this because it's very specific to this current episode as well, is that many times over, Kendall proves himself to look like he is just a suit. He can talk the talk. He knows all the corporate jargon. As a matter of fact, he crams as much of it as he can into every single sentence, and is excruciating in this current episode when we get to it about how he can't speak a sentence without throwing some jargon in there. So he definitely can speak the speak. He's learned from maybe watching his dad and being in those rooms, but it feels like such a put on, and he feels like such an empty suit. But then he sometimes is pretty savvy, and he can, when he kind of gets out of his way and actually gets serious, he can really make some moves. So he's both things, and I think Jeremy Strong gives a really strong, no pun intended, performance as Kendall, and he's really a very, very corner. I mean, his performance is central to the entire show, and maybe more so than ever this season. We'll have to see how that goes. But there's a lot of power plays. His family's behind him sometimes. They're trying to make their own power plays, so they're trying to get Dad out. But at the same time, they don't want to give Kendall all the power. So there's all this jockeying for favoritism with the dad. And even when the dad just drops a hint that maybe it's you, and that's it. That's all he needs to do to blow up any kind of partnership between these kids. And as you see this play out now, I have to anyway, as I watch this, think that this is the toxic dynamic that has been playing out in this family from day one. So that's one of the real fascinating things with the show. It's so well written, and you could just feel that all this animosity, that when they're on each other's sides, you see them joking about things that happened when they were young. You see them angry about things that happened 20, 30 years earlier. And then you see how the dad can just turn them against each other with the tiniest little touch. And you know that this is the relationship that's been there from the very beginning. So all great stuff. But season 1 wraps up with Kendall once again kind of having a real play. Finally, after the whole entire season of trying to get partners in place to really take an aggressive, to take control of the company from under his dad. He really seems like he's about to be able to do it. The family's all together for Shiv's wedding, even though Kendall and Logan have this animosity, and there's a lot of strutting around. But Kendall finally breaks down, does some drugs with one of the workers, this young guy working the wedding, and there's an accident. That waiter, that server, dies. And Kendall goes back to his dad. His dad covers it all up, but now the dad's like, and now you do what I want. So the power dynamic has shifted again, and it's a really, really tragic finale to this first season. Once again, not because these people are good people, but you got to feel for Kendall, who's trying to escape this toxic relationship with his dad and right back into the fold again. So really fascinating finale to that first season. And then season 2 is even stronger. We see that the dad keeps needling him with this relationship over the course of it. Now, at this point, the show is like in a flow state. They're just kind of riffing off of each other. These characters are just bumping against each other. We start discovering things about Logan's background. We find out that the company's in a lot more trouble than we thought. He doesn't want the kids to know about all these financial problems. He makes it sound like, I'm just trying to protect you guys. But in a way, I think he just doesn't want to be weak. He doesn't even trust his own kids. They could turn on him like a pack of hungry wolves, disloyal to their own pack if they smell any kind of blood. And of course, the dad speaks to that relationship again. The dad cannot show any weakness. That's his philosophy. So this goes on for a while. There's a lot of really funny stuff here with Tom and Greg. Just great. I haven't mentioned Greg yet. Nicholas Braun, what a great, and Tom as well. Just two great performances. And they're almost like two versions of themselves, like separated by a decade or so. They're two buffoons. But I got to tell you, Greg, in a way, in his own buffoonish way, is maybe the savviest character here. He always finds that opportunity and takes it. He might be the real heir to this whole thing. And I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up in the control of this thing at some point. But to that savviness, they start finding out there's a lot of not only financial problems with the cruise lines, which is what Tom's been put in charge of because they think it's the amusement parks and cruise lines are kind of like whatever, it's garbage. But he's put in charge of them. They find out that there was financial impropriety, and worse than that, they find out that there was a bunch of sexual assault allegations that were all covered up. Some of this perpetrated by the employees of the company. Some of them just covered up on the cruises themselves because they didn't want the cruises to have a bad reputation. And there's a lot of paperwork saying that they knew all about it. So when this story starts coming out, there's a lot of exposure, and this puts the company in a weak spot again. And this means that Kendall has an opportunity to partner with Logan's, one of his biggest rivals, along with Stewie, who's a character in the background who's just like a rich, basically it's either Saudi Arabia or an analog to Saudi Arabia, just kind of these big banks or these big funds there that invest hugely into these different organizations. So between Stewie and Logan's main rival, there's an opportunity to do something called a bear hug, which is basically like a corporate takeover, an aggressive corporate takeover. And they're using this scandal, as leverage point. And this whole season culminates with Logan basically looking at Kendall and saying he's so weak after the death of this young guy, and maybe falling off the wagon again. And his dad just looks at him with disdain and says, "You're not a killer. You don't have what it takes to be CEO. But we need a blood sacrifice," as he calls it, which means that he needs a member of the family to take the fall. And for maybe the second half of the season, we really think that Logan is preparing to take that fall. But no, when in the biggest slap in the face of the show, it turns out that Kendall is the one that Logan expects to take the fall. It's horrible. Jeremy Strong, once again, just the hurt on his face when his dad basically says, "You're going to take this fall and you're going to do this. And it's good for everybody. Just suck it up and do it." And of course, he still has his blackmail on him as well, right? So he knows that. So it's just the worst way that a father could treat his son, to be honest. Someone who has their whole lives ahead of them and a young family. The dad is, he's in his 80s, right? Like this guy's not long for the world. By the time the court proceedings are done, he'd be dead. But he would rather throw his son under the bus because he's such a selfish prick. And that's where we look like we're going to end season 2. And we're like, oh my God, this guy again. But he doesn't. He goes and he comes out and he says, "My dad is a toxic person. He knew all about this." And we pick up season 3 immediately after that moment, after that press conference. So now you're all caught up. Let's talk about season 3, episode 1 of Succession, called Secession.
Greg, how's that?
Headline is the internet is big, obviously, and I couldn't read it all, but I'm working through. I guess, that's the big picture over here at Media Monitoring.
Is it positive, Greg?
Super positive.
Super positive.
Yeah, the negative stuff does tend to stick in the mind a little, just because it's quite visceral. But yeah, basically very good. Nice memes, good memeage, and so on.
So my general impressions of this episode, once again, this is really a Kendall episode. And it's funny that in the experience of the show, the different siblings really seem to have equal weight. But honestly, didn't even think about it until this moment when I was recapping those first 2 seasons. So much of this is this emotional journey of Kendall, right? Who maybe took the brunt of the emotional abuse from the dad, being the oldest. Maybe the expectations were highest that he was going to inherit this thing. And maybe that's part of his addiction problems. And here we are again with this episode. And it's so well done, by the way the show is assembled is so clever. This person and this performance could be so annoying if it wasn't for the fact that the first time we see Kendall in this episode, it's him basically trying to submerge himself into this bathtub, whether it's disappearing or a fantasy of a drowning, whatever it happens to be. This just him just disappearing behind the edge of that empty tub is so important because it tells us that this is what's happening inside his mind, even though now for the rest of the episode, we're going to see 2 things. One is he's going to be projecting this confidence. And you see that he's attracted, like so many people want Logan to go down, that he is probably attracting people who are way above his pay grade, people who are desperate to get on this right side of history, let's say, and take down Logan, even though I think that everybody can just see through him immediately. You just see him trying so hard to control the conversation. As soon as he's surrounded by people who might have just a little bit more savvy than he does, he has to kind of try to usurp them. And it's such an interesting portrayal. And it's so irritating, like everything he does here, but fascinating, especially when we once again think of that opening scene where he's basically wanting to disappear. So internally, he is still this scared little boy, but externally, he has to portray, and this part of this is what he's been trained to do by his dad. And part of it is just a simple fact that it is the expectation. You don't go and take a shot at Logan Roy in this world and then just tuck your tail between your legs and walk away. The irony of all that, by the way, is he actually has a power play by keeping his mouth shut, but he can't even do that. And the conversation, this three-way conversation mediated by Jess, a great performance and such a big role. Even the small players, these are people who are literally have big roles in other shows, who come in for one scene here and there just because they have this, legacy within the context of this show, but also because they just want to be part of this, just want to read these lines, just play these scenes because they're so great. But that three-way conversation between Logan, with her mediating between the two of them, when he's like saying, I'm too busy to take this call, and yet he's eavesdropping and even talking in the background. I'm sure his dad can hear all of this. So funny, so desperate.
Jess Jordan on Kendall's phone.
Is it him?
Hi. Kendall's just attending to some other matters, but I can pass on your thoughts.
What'd he say?
Do you want to know?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell him. He says that this could get very ugly for him. You played a decent move. If you were to retract and say that you were unwell and that you misspoke, then maybe there's a deal here.
You know what? Tell him legally it's not wise for me to talk to him, but that I'm going to be in contact with the government and that this would be a good moment for him to step down.
Okay, he heard.
That I'm gonna grind his fucking bones to make my bread.
He says in that case, he's going to grind up your bones to make his bread.
Okay, well, tell him that I'm gonna run up off the fucking beanstalk.
Okay, Logan, yeah, he says in that case, he's going to run up off the beanstalk. He's kind of laughing, but not like nice laughing.
And so great. And speaking of funny and great, that whole car ride, most of this episode is him driving around Manhattan, not having fully planned this out, by the way. Once again, not very well thought out. This idea of him saying, like, I'm going to take the corporate SUV back to the offices. And yet it's like you're driving around in the car, and as soon as you step out of this car, you will not be able to step back into it. And you're not going to be able to go to your office because you have been denied access to your office. So he's not thinking about the fact that he's basically attacking the corporation, and he still expects that all his amenities to be in place. So this just shows how short-sighted he is. And he ends up landing one safe haven he has in the city, which is at Rava, his ex-wife's. And what a fascinating turn of events here. He has Rava there. He has his new girlfriend there. He has them in the room together. He wants to have this feeling, this sense that he's such an important person and he has these strong women around him. He's trying to hire strong women because, of course, there's some Me Too aspects to this investigation on the cruise lines. So obviously the optics are very good to have a woman representing you. But at the same time, he wants to have this sense of himself. And part of that is like going back into the fold, looking for the acceptance of his wife. And it's so interesting that here she is, his ex. And she is, honestly, when he's saying, well, how do you think it's going to go? She's like, oh, you might succeed. I don't even think she's trying to get digs in on him, although this might be part of their relationship problem, that maybe she always was like this, maybe not as encouraging as she could have been. I just find it very interesting that he's still looking for her approval. He still has to have like these women fighting over him, or at least he wants to project that they're fighting over him, or he needs this validation. And also fascinatingly that she even says to him, congratulations, I heard what you did. He says to her, did you hear the press conference? And she's like, no, like she read the headline, but she didn't even bother listening to the press conference. So even then, this isn't even that important to her, even though it should be a huge event. And honestly, it's a huge event for her too, right? Because I'm sure that a lot of her wealth and her success comes from, the support she gets from him. And maybe this just speaks to the fact that she's probably exhausted because I'm sure she has heard him probably the 10th or 15th iteration of this attempted takedown of his dad. And she's like, well, maybe this time it'll work. Hey. And maybe she's just being practical about it because I'm sure she's heard Kendall complain about him for her entire lives together, which has been decades at this point. Very interesting. And this is a very, very Kendall-focused episode. But even outside of Kendall, we have a lot of interesting things happening, right? We see that Logan is basically trying to jet set, like literally just staying on planes and flying from one country to another, looking for any locations around the world where they don't have a non-extradition treaty with the U.S. The fact that his other children are still basically standing by his side is so funny that if you're on the plane with your dad and your dad's immediate reaction to this press conference is that I cannot go anywhere where there's an extradition treaty with the U.S., is probably not the biggest sign of confidence. But of course, he sends the kids right back to the belly of the beast. Not all of them. Tom stays behind. I'm sure that Tom stays behind not because he actually values Tom's input. It's because Tom knows where the bodies are buried. And I actually didn't mention this during the recap of season 2, but very importantly, Greg and Tom. Tom was put in charge of the cruises and amusement parks. It was considered unimportant. The scandal now is coming from there. Tom was supposed to destroy all of the evidence that implicated the family, their awareness of these problems. Tom didn't want to do that work, thought it was beneath him. He offloaded it to Greg. Greg was smart enough, with consultation from, I believe, his mom, to not destroy everything. He made copies. It's pretty funny that he made copies and destroyed the files. He made a copy of the files and shredded it. So when realistically, he could have just shredded blank pieces of paper and kept the original documents in those storage lockers. But hey, whatever. He copied them and shredded them simultaneously. Maybe double work, but regardless. And he has them stored somewhere in the city. So he is the linchpin to this whole thing. If he now, in the next episode or so, decides to tell Kendall, I have all these papers, it can take down the family, and Logan specifically, and maybe set Kendall up to be the next CEO. If, on the other hand, Greg leaks this to somebody and goes to the highest bidder and tells Logan, hey, look, I have these papers, I can destroy them, and maybe this is the loyalty to Tom, maybe this becomes a leverage for either Tom or maybe even Shiv to take control of the company. So this is a huge part of this. And once again, Greg is in the middle of it. So Greg, who's just this loser who just popped up randomly because he needed to get bailed out yet again for getting high on the job, all the way back in season 1, is now a major player in this whole drama. The other big thing that happens here at the very end, of course, we actually get a CEO, interim CEO, and they decide it's better if it's a woman. And when Shiv doesn't come through with her friendship, getting a kind of like a liberal stalwart lawyer on their side to represent, turns out not only did she not get her, friendship didn't actually pull enough weight, turns out she's worse than that, she's working for Kendall. Logan sees this as a big sign of weakness, and he's always testing Shiv for some reason. There's an indication that maybe he thinks she's the one best for this. And yet, I don't know if it's his sexism or if it's the fact that her politics are more to the left of his, supposedly. That's a big question mark as to whether that's true or not. But regardless of the why, he doesn't seem that he's really going to ever give her the power. But he does think that the optics are good to have a woman there. So Jerry ends up getting it. And honestly, Jerry almost looked like she was going to get this thing last year. So it's kind of a natural conclusion to that. Of course, we had this whole strange, almost sexual relationship. It's a sexual relationship on Roman's side. I don't know if it's a sexual relationship or any relationship at all on Jerry's side. Remains to be seen. But Roman is turned on by Jerry. Roman apparently is asexual. This is maybe the only person in a very long time that he has had sexual affinity for. And he's kind of fixated on her. And this seems to be not only some kind of perversion on his side, it seems to be legitimate. He does pitch Jerry over himself. Roman is actually, maybe unbeknownst to himself, he's near the top of the list of getting that role. As soon as he puts Jerry, says, well, maybe Jerry would be better than me. The second that happens, once again, Logan sees it as a sign of weakness. He's immediately out. He's out as a contestant. So it's Jerry for now. But Jerry's very savvy. Not only is she's very political, and she's always looking to maximize her gain, but she knows how to play all the angles. So I'm curious to see what happens with her and with Frank. Frank is desperately trying to maybe step in there. Logan's having no part of it. He does put his name in there anyway. And when Shiv finds out that Jerry's the one who got the role, she is furious. And she says, you know what? I'm going somewhere else. So question mark, where is she leaving at the end of that episode? I think she's meeting with Kendall. Is she going to collaborate with him, or is she just going to have an open conversation with him about the state of affairs? Not sure, but I'm pretty sure she's headed to see Kendall. Roman is trying to further align himself with Jerry, who's going to be interim CEO. And part of this is his affection. Part of this is a power play. The two things just happen to be in line with each other. And that's where we are heading to next week. Beyond that, there is just so many great lines here, whether it's Greg talking about how he can't read the whole internet or talking about how the sentiment on the internet seems to be positive overall, but the negative ones really stick in your mind. Isn't that the internet in general? Anyway, but it is great. So Greg has so many great lines here. The three-way conversation I mentioned with Kendall, great, so funny. And Roman has some great, shivvy, shivvy, shiv. His little song he comes up with, taunting his sister. Pretty funny. So a lot of great stuff here. What's his name? I can't remember his name now, but that lawyer that's always around, that the fact that he's desperate for a sandwich, he's got to get a sandwich. They're about to get on a plane. He's like, he doesn't care. He's hungry. He needs to get a sandwich. So just all these little character details are great. And that's where we are. If I've had criticism, I've heard, mostly unanimous praise. I mean, I think that the people who are on board with the show are 100% on board at this point. And of course, the critics are loving it. The critics have seen the first 7 episodes. I've only seen the first. I do not get access to these screeners. I'm not an actual critic. I just do this as a hobby. But people who have seen it say that the show is great this year. It's like highest rated season so far by the critics. And like I said, the critics have seen most of the episodes. So they've probably seen the shape of the season. I would say at this point, not knowing what that shape of the season is, I'm sure there's spoilers out there. I am not going to get spoiled at all. I'm sure it's all out there, but I'm not going to look for it. I'm going to try to go week to week. I like to digest this show slowly. I don't want to binge it. Unlike something like Squid Game, which I loved, but I binged the whole thing in about a day and a half or so. This one I really like to savor. I might even rewatch it again just before the next episode. But I would say on a negative side, and I've heard a little bit of this on the internet as well, and I agree with this, is that I really do feel like we are resetting again. This is maybe the third time in the show where we're kind of resetting that. First it was his dad's stroke, then it was the breaking of the scandal initially, and then they were able to renegotiate some finances to prevent this bear hug from happening. And then, of course, now this scandal has now weakened. Logan has basically leveraged to buy a bigger stake in the company to prevent this bear hug from happening. But now those creditors are basically saying, we don't have confidence. So, you're going to have to pay us back, which means that you won't have enough stake to control the business. So the bear hug now is totally in play again. We're back and it really does feel like we're resetting over and over and over again. And the stakes keep getting higher right now. At this point, like Logan literally can end up in jail at this moment. That's why he's flying all over the world trying to escape extradition. So the stakes keep climbing, but it seems like we're seeing the same thing at a higher and higher rate. So I do think that at the end of this season, by the end of this season, the stakes have to change, right? Like something has to happen where the businesses get split. There has to be some kind of internal competition. Maybe there's different factions are running the business together. And now we can see how these different components of the business are at each other's throats, spreading blame, competing for funds, competing for prestige. Something like that has to happen because I don't think we could just end the season again and be like, and Logan's on top and he, pushed the family's buttons and they're all back in their holes again. And then next season, some other drama will throw everything back up in the air and we'll just start over and over and over. I think at that point, it would become tedious. For now, I'm on board. I just love watching this family dynamic. So I really do kind of save that judgment for the end of the season. I'm aware of the criticism and I feel it myself, by the way. I kind of feel like my wife even said it, her quick recap of this after she watched it was, so we're kind of back where we were before. She still enjoyed it, but I have the same feeling that we're kind of like, okay, so now we're back to, each season we're at a point where there's this breaking point where is Kendall going to get control of the business or not? And I honestly don't think Kendall's going to get control of the business. I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. But at the same time, I think that the stakes of the story have to change by the end of this season. And I do think they will, by the way. I think that they're aware of the limitations of this repetitive structure. So I do think we're going to see that. And I'm very curious to see what happens next. You see the coming up at the end, if you watch the coming episodes. It's not for the next episode. I think it's for the rest of the season. They kind of preview. And it does look like there's going to be some pretty interesting dynamic changes between enemies and friends and frenemies throughout the season. So I'm curious to see how all those dynamics play out. And I have a lot of confidence that they're going to take the show in a satisfying direction. Either way, I'll always love Greg's one-liners. And there's plenty of them. So that's it. That's my recap for this episode. I will probably have some bonus content, be interviewing Sona and my wife. Any additional material they provide, I'll be appending to this episode, most likely. Unless it goes really long, then I might actually put a whole separate episode. But I'll probably just append it here. And I'll repost with notes if that's the case, if you want to come back and check out to see if there's any additional conversation here. But overall, really enjoyed it. Looking forward to next week. Make sure you follow us. Remember, this weekend, I will be dropping some horror recommendations plus a full review of the movie Dune. Very much looking forward to that. I don't know if I'm going to like it or not, but I'm very interested in seeing how it turned out. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.